any reason for that? Was it such an extraordinary coincidence?
It's not an uncommon name, but big head.
Sure.
It's a linguist. Yes, I go through that with the undergraduates every time.
We can set up medieval phrases, no doubt. But one book that occurs to me is the book, the Tractate of Brochot, which is written about the 2nd century, where the rabbis ask themselves, at what stage in the day do you say the morning prayers? And the answer is when a man can distinguish between when it's dawn, first light. So how can you say when it's first light? And there's a long discussion about when you can tell the difference between white and blue. So then they ask, what shade of blue? And there's pages and pages of description of how you decide the shade. And finally they come to the conclusion that there's one particular snail which has a particular dye, which has a certain hue and intensity, which when it's stained on cloth will give you, at its slightest dilution, that blue colour. It's interesting. So, you know, this idea of perception, I mean, and certainly presumably, you know, when I look at traffic lights now, I find that traffic lights look slightly blue rather than green because of cataract. You know, I mean, I probably have to say something done about it. But this aspect of perception is also interesting physiologically too.
I mean, I think it's been important to us in looking at his writing that his main instrument of measurement was his own senses. And I think there are two things about that. I think it's funny, so I got into work on visual perception, starting out as a physicist and then doing psychology options. And it's interesting talking to physicists about perception because people will often think that vision is perception must be imprecise in some way. But we can make very, very precise perceptual judgments. So the absolute threshold for detecting light, when you're fully dark adapted, you only need a few photons to be stimulating the retina to be able to make a reliable judgment that there's a stimulus there. And so it's easy to fall into the trap that because he only had perception as an instrument of measurement, it must be imprecise. But also I think it's important that we know the types of constraints that will put on his observations. So for example, the fact that our colour vision is trichromatic is a constraint on human perception that can't be undone. The only thing you can sense is the signals in the 3 classes of cone. You don't have access to the full wavelength spectrum through your own senses.
I mean, people presumably in the 13th century are living quite a lot of the time in pretty dark surroundings.
I guess so. Not during us.
Not during the daytime. we have of course we have this dreadful misnomer, the Dark Ages, and you know I've come to the conclusion the only dark thing about them is our ignorance. There's not another sense in which these aren't intellectually dark. And something that, taking on from your point, I think one thing that we've noticed is, which is perhaps shouldn't have been surprised about, is when your own perception is your only instrument, you make it as acute as possible. And I don't know, but I was just very impressed when it became clear to us that Grosseteste had clearly looked hard at rainbows. You know, we tend to, oh, there's a nice rainbow. Yes, red, green, blue, yellow. But actually, the fact that he'd looked hard enough to see that there are different types of rainbows and had remembered them and then thought about them. He thinks about this then highly mathematical abstraction of these acute observations, the space of all possible rainbows. Is well, you know, he's fascinated by light. I think it's
even within dark spaces, there's some wonderful work being done in Norway on reconstructing altarfrontals, in particular with the techniques of overlaying silver onto gold. And they've done an experiment in an experimental church, which is doesn't function as a church, but there's only natural light there. these things literally glow as you come into the church. So I think there's in church architecture they might look dark, but in the Middle Ages they'd have been extraordinary bright places where you wanted to position your particular furniture. So,
I hope the audience have got a question. Has anyone got a question? I want to carry on. Great, wonderful. So let's have a microphone for a few questions. There's a gentleman here with his hand. Well, you're there, so